Welcome everyone to today's book event. We'll be discussing today Sacrificial Limbs, the book on masculinity, disability, and political violence in Turkey. My name is Nadia Ali, and I'm director of the Center for Middle East Studies here at Brown. I'm also professor of anthropology and Middle East Studies. And the event today is part of a wider initiative in which we explore issues linked to Kurdish studies, Kurdish issues in the region, but also the initiative on gender and sexuality. I would like to introduce the two speakers, guests today. The first one is the author of the book, which is Salih Can Akçöksöz. Can is an assistant professor of anthropology at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA. Can received his PhD in anthropology from the University of Texas at Austin in 2011. He served as Mellon postdoctoral fellow in Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at the College of William and Mary, and he was assistant professor of Middle Eastern and North African Studies at the University of Arizona. His work has appeared in journals including Journal of Ottoman and Turkish Studies, the Journal of Middle East Women Studies, Current Anthropology, Medical Anthropology Quarterly, and Culture, Medicine, and Psychiatry. His new book project, provisionally entitled Humanitarian Borderlands, Medicine, Care, and Terror along Turkey's Syrian border, examines the politics and political economy of humanitarian healthcare. But today, of course, we're speaking about his his current book, which was recently published. As I said, Sacrificial Limbs, Masculinity, Disability, and Political Violence in Turkey. And the book recently won the Mesa Fatma Mernissi Book Award. Can, are you there? Can you switch on your camera? I want to welcome you. Hello.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Nadia, for this introduction and for inviting me.
Good.
I would like to thank the Kurdish Studies Initiative and the Center for Middle Eastern Studies for making this event happen.
Great.
Welcome, everyone.
Thanks. Well, I'm also really excited because we have a second guest today. That is Mehmet Kurd. Professor Mehmet Kurd is the Marie Sklodowska-Curie Global Fellow at the London School of Economics, the LSE, and also a lecturer at Yale University Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies. His research lies at the intersection of an anthropology of religion, political sociology, and ethnography, with a specific focus on political Islam and civil society in Kurdish Turkey, and also among the Turkish diaspora in Europe and the US. Mehmet examines the relationship between state policy and non-state actors to better understand Islamist mobilization, its political, social, and economic grounds, and its influences in comparative perspective. Mehmet is the author of Kurdish Hezbollah in Turkey, Islamism, Violence, and the State, which was published by Pluto in 2017. Welcome, Mehmet.
Thank you, Nadia. Thank you, everyone. Hello, Can. Hello, Nadia. Hello, Barbara.
So just to briefly describe what's happening, we'll be in conversation for a while. I encourage you to post your questions via the Q&A function, or if you follow us via YouTube, you can also put in the questions and they'll be fed to us. But we're starting out, Can, so reading your book, which is a very in-depth ethnography of Turkish war veterans, and it covers a wide range of issues. I mean, from the intersections of disability and gender, militarism, nationalism, and also, of course, masculinity. It is not an obvious choice of topic to focus on Turkish nationalist war veterans. So I'm very interested in the history of the book, the trajectory. How did you decide to write this book? What is behind the idea of the book?
Sure. I start the book in the acknowledgements by the sentence, it's often said that a director's first film is always somewhat autobiographical, and the same can be said for ethnographies. It can definitely be said for this ethnography. I grew up in Turkey in the 80s and 90s, and in the aftermath of the bloody 1980 military coup, and in the heyday, during the heyday of the Kurdish conflict. And since this is a book on masculinity, I should mention that the two father figures in my life, one a leftist political prisoner and the other a politically conscious Kurd, made me intimately aware of the vicissitudes of state violence in Turkey. And as I acquired political consciousness myself in the 90s, those were the days when the state deployed millions of soldiers and paramilitary village guards against the guerrilla army of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, PKK. So in 1989, if in retrospect I was to pick a certain point for my decision, I would go for 1989, when I saw in a movie theater in Istanbul, Oliver Stone's Born on the 4th of July. For those of you who are not familiar with the film, it tells the story of the paralyzed Vietnam veteran and anti-war hero, Ron Kovic. And the film left a deep impact on me. I mean, discovering the civil war in my own country in those days, I remember thinking very clearly why there's no anti-war kind of peace activism among ex-soldiers in Turkey. But of course, that was a long time ago. The decision to write a book on the subjects, the actual subjects who were tasked to fight Turkey's Kurdish conflict, the decision was made in the 2000s when I was a graduate student in American academia. It was right around the time of post 9/11 period, the days of the so-called global war on terror, and of course American occupations and wars in Afghanistan and Iraq triggered the biggest veterans and disabled veterans movement in the United States since the Vietnam era. And it also triggered a kind of renewed interest in questions of state violence, veterans, sovereignty in anthropology. So, Kurdish conflict basically defines the main parameters of Turkey's political life. But until that point, no one had ever written on, people who were fighting this war for the Turkish state. And I wanted to write a book that would highlight the embodied consequences of this war by focusing on the disabled veterans who were becoming extremely visible as political actors in those days in the 2000s, early 2000s.
Right, thank you. Well, the title is quite wide-ranging and ambitious, and you are covering quite a bit of ground in the book. So what would you say is your main contribution, both empirically, but also theoretically? I mean, you are, addressing a number of conceptual issues. What do you perceive to be your main conceptual contributions?
This is a very broad question. I'll try to keep it short and focused. So empirically, obviously, the book contributes to our understanding of the cultural dynamics of Turkey's Kurdish conflict and nationalist politics, quandaries of militarization and military masculinities, and also the politics of disability in Turkey. More broadly, the book speaks to three large anthropological questions that I'm really interested in. The first is, how can we understand violence not only as a destructive, but also as a generative force that gives way to new forms of embodiment, community, and political agency? And that's what I try to do in the book by looking at the post-injury lives and political activism of disabled veterans in their wartime communities with martyrs' families. The second question that I'm really interested in is, what is the role of embodied experience in the constitution of political subjects? I'm very interested in the processes of political subject formation as illustrated by my interest in the ultranationalist politicization of disabled veterans. And I'm particularly interested in figuring out, what role their embodied experiences of disability played in the formation of their political identities and agencies. And the third question, which gives its title to the book, concerns the issue of sacrifice. How does sacrifice play into modern regimes of state power and sovereignty? So these are the three main questions. As I address these questions, I build on, or I join the productive dialogue, recent productive dialogue between disability and gender studies to show how masculinity and disability get co-constituted at a nexus of ableism, militarism, nationalism, and neoliberalism. Although I build on disability studies, which is a very Euro-America-centric kind of interdisciplinary field, I also challenge disability studies to tackle the global importance of war and political violence as central causes of impairment and disability. And this last point is particularly important for the Middle East because, from war-related toxicity that leads to congenital disabilities in Iraq to, incredible number of amputations in Syria and in Iran and in Iraq and now in Yemen, political violence and war play a key role in the creation of disabled bodies in the region. So, yeah, I think these are the main areas that my book contributes to.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think I'll later might come back to the question of the intersection between gender and disability.
Sure.
But I guess the next question that I have really links to your method and the ethnography, because one of the things that reading the book, it's very obvious. It's a very thick description. It's full of anecdotes. It's, you spent obviously quite some time with the war veterans. You traveled with them. You attended meetings, and there are jokes. There are sort of everyday experiences. Sometimes it's difficult to read because of some of the things they're saying. And so I guess I want to probe you a bit on that, because once I did actually decide that I wouldn't understand anymore what's happening to women in Iraq if I wouldn't study men and masculinities. So I had this idea that I do research on Iraqi men and masculinities, and then I ended up speaking to these men who said, "Oh, don't worry, we can introduce you to insurgents in Syria," and I couldn't do it. Now, I'm just sort of wondering. Obviously, you're very different positioned than I am, but how did you actually manage the fieldwork experience, given that you were dealing with not just war veterans, but ultranationalist, largely war veterans?
So first, let me start by giving a very brief overview of my fieldwork, which I discuss in detail in the book's preface, partly because of the questions you raised, because it was a difficult field experience for me. And not only the field experience, but the aftermath of the field was also difficult because of a variety of reasons that I'll touch upon very briefly. So I spent 29 months in the field. And I basically conducted fieldwork in the cities of Istanbul and Ankara. And I combined various research methods, including ethnographic methods, obviously. I collected life histories. I conducted participant observation in multiple places, the most important being the grassroots, somehow ultranationalist disabled veterans and martyrs families associations, which also served as hubs of redistribution and everyday socialization, etc. And then I did all sorts of archival research. Now, I start the preface by saying, this kind of narrative of my fieldwork experience is this kind of illusionary mastery over all kinds of difficulties and turbulences that I experienced during the fieldwork. It was a difficult fieldwork, partly because, of course, politically, I was in a very different place than my veterans. But because of this political difference, of course, I was not sympathetic to their activism. But at the same time, they were working class men hailing from either rural poor families or lumpen proletariat families, and they got disabled as involuntarily conscripted soldiers, and they were subjected to all sorts of symbolic and structural violence as disabled men. So there was this kind of deep connection that we built, but then this connection was troubled by their political activism. I often use the word gray zone to describe my research process. Now, gray zone is a term that was initially coined by the Italian Jewish Holocaust survivor Primo Levi, who used the term to talk about the kind of ethical complexities of that were experienced by Jewish prisoners who basically were serving in special squads for Nazis and were responsible for everyday operation of concentration camps. And Primo Levi uses them to talk about the kind of the ethical dilemmas surrounding complicity, collaboration, and survival in zones of extreme violence. And the concept has been taken up by anthropologists who kind of talk about similar kind of ethical ambiguities in zones of violence, if not that extreme. And I also think that my research was a kind of entering in a gray zone thing because of the ethical complexity of the positionality of my informants. On the one hand, they were victims of state violence because they were involuntarily conscripted. And on the other hand, they were perpetrators of state violence as soldiers, right? And then this situation became even further complex during my fieldwork as my informants, so to speak, joined in an ultranationalist witch hunt against public intellectuals who voiced dissident perspectives on minority rights in Turkey. And one of those intellectuals was Armenian journalist Chronicling, who was murdered in the course of my fieldwork, which actually alienated me from the most activist circles among my informants because it became kind of unbearable to witness their political activism on a day-to-day basis. Okay, so this is the kind of fieldwork period. And then what made things even more complicated after my fieldwork was that immediately after completing my doctoral study, which forms the backbone of this book, I was also conscripted as a citizen of Turkey, and so I also became a subject of state violence in a way. Although as a privileged person, I had the option of paying the state $7,000 and serving only for the basic training period, not being deployed in the Kurdish region, etc. And then finally, I signed the famous peace petition that basically asked the state to stop human rights abuses against Kurdish civilians in the 2010s and the government to return to the peace table with the PKK. And because of the peace petition, most of you would know that all the academics who signed the petition were targeted in many ways. I was again privileged because I was based in the United States, but signing the petition basically meant my banishment from the field forever, because now I was one of the traitor terrorists, terrorists that my informants hated so much and campaigned against. And it was a big loss for me personally. So there were all kinds of emotional difficulties that I experienced in the course of my fieldwork, obviously, we can talk about these more, and in the aftermath of it, because of these multiple becomings and encounters with the state.
Yeah, I'm sure we come back to some of those. I mean, these are very, complex and difficult issues and have all kinds of ethical complexities. But I really like to hear from Mehmet now. Mehmet, given your own research, but also positionality, I'm very curious to know your reactions and reflections on Jan's book. You have to unmute yourself.
Okay. Thank you very much. Well, in terms of my research and positionality, I think Jan has done a spectacular job by delving into a difficult field of research. And in many cases, we see ethnographers working in settings whereas they have more sympathy with their informants, and conducting field work with people you wouldn't have same political, ideological, or to some extent cultural familiarities or affinity is a difficult issue, both methodologically and ethically. Conducting my field work with former Hezbollah members who are held responsible for executing more than 500 Kurdish civilians and getting involved in the Kurdish war in the 1990s, in Kurdish conflict. I see many parallels between our research, and I think the first is this researching the unglamorous, as we can describe it. And secondly, I think the gender construct of martyrdom and sacrifice have many parallels between the Hezbollah base and the group that Jan wrote about. And obviously, both researchers deal with this dark heritage of the 1990s. So,
Hey, Mehmet, because I think most people wouldn't have read your book. Can you say a little bit more about that? How do you see the parallel in terms of gender and Hezbollah? I assume it's the idea of masculinity. And Jan's book. How did masculinity come into play in your research?
Yeah, well, in a chapter of my book, basically, I deal with this question: how the discourses around martyrdom, shahadat, and to a limited extent about Ghazilik as well, is very much gendered, masculinized, and it is almost like kind of a zone dedicated or special to man. So I investigated the stories written by the Hezbollah members, mostly kind of autobiographical accounts of what happened in the 1990s, and kind of I tried to locate the gender discussions of this remembrance of the past as well. So, I mean, as you said, the book is beautifully written. Ethnographic texture is very rich and vivid. It starts from a journey from the mountains, or being on the mountains. And well, the first chapter of the book tells about a story, a travel between Diyarbakir and Bingöl, which I made for years, every single week. But then this journey takes us to the hospital corners, to the living rooms of war veterans, ultranationalist protests, graveyards, state institutions, commemorations, and it's kind of a journey of a rupture from pre-conscription to the post-injury period, and tell us about, and I'm quoting from Jan's book, a double life as their bodies traverse two opposing regimes of value. In one, they are subjected as men with disabilities to the class and gender exigencies of deeply ableist society. In another, they are leonized as religio-national heroes, sanctified by their sacrifices. And I think John does a great job of telling about this double life and the ways in which this becomes a setting for political activism, ultranationalist protests, and question of sacrificial crisis and debt that can never be paid. And also the great moments, I think, like this ethnographic intimacy that we see in some passages. I have never been to these associations, and as a Kurd, I don't think that I am interested in being there, but I feel like kind of, you know, I have walked around those rooms and the hallway, and I saw the pictures and so on. One of those moments, I think, kind of like reminds me of like this, metaphorically speaking, that John is starting to step on a landmine in the ethnography when he tries to use an iron weight as a doorstop, but which is kind of a symbiotic limb used by the perpetrator, Rafet. And there, I think not only this moment, but also Rafet's story, or Rafi's story, is very interesting one, because after they become good friends, Rafet confesses to John that he's Armenian. So I really wondered how Rafet and Rafi negotiated all those tensions. And also I was curious to basically read more about it. Who was he? Where did he come from? How was his reaction, for example, to the murder of Hrant Dink and all those questions? And this brings me to more questions about the diversity within war veterans. Mm-hmm. So in this ultranationalist construct, we see that most of these people, at least on the surface, representing a Turkish Sunni subjectivity. But as we know, military service is compulsory for every citizen of Turkey, so for 20 million of Kurds. So was there any Kurdish war veteran, for example? And how was their relation to these communities was a question I really wondered. But beyond that, also, I was curious about the diversity within these war veterans in relation to the village guards. I mean, to give a little information, in the 1990s, this scheme of village guards were introduced as a paramilitary force to fight against the PKK. Many Kurdish people who either for multiple reasons, basically accepted to be village guards, and they were at the forefront of this fight. So what happened to them, and like how is their relation to the state as war veterans, but also to these communities of loss as well? And I think one of the questions that kind of evokes more questions in my mind is the question of being in the mountains. John tells about this intimate moments, how the mountains are perceived and all. But at the same time, I kind of really wanted to read a section of how these people remembered, responded, or narrated the situation in the 1990s, especially in relation to not mountains, but when they came down from the mountains and burned the Kurdish villages, evacuated the villages, raped the women, killed men. Because, I mean, again, for unfamiliar audience, in the 1990s, about 4,000 Kurdish villages were evacuated by the soldiers. Some villages were burned down to ashes. Many people were killed, and all this heaviness. So I wonder whether these issues came up in the conversation or not, or whether you ask about it, or what did you do? Because, like, you know, I see this tension when, for example, when you asked about Apo to one of your informants, and like, you know, there is a tension, like as if it is kind of like a dangerous zone to step into. And I kind of also make parallels between my work and John's work as well, because like Hezbollah members have this silenced memories of the past in the of the 1990s. Usually through silence of this issue, basically you can kind of tell something what was going on and like how they remember it or how they try not to. So this will be a second question for me. And I think a third one is about the Southeast syndrome. So in the book, you talk about Southeast syndrome, but you don't really delve into the situation of mental health problems that was caused by the civil war in the 1990s and how this plays a role in the discourse constructed around the Gazilik and like, you know, all entitlement that comes with it. How Gazis, for example, consider those people who lost their minds on the battleground, those people, and obviously the relations between the petty crimes, the mafia, and these issues as well. And I think a last issue is the question of debt or the sacrificial crisis and the issues that kind of stem from this situation. It reminds me of the heaviness of bedel, the value and debt on the other side. I mean, as you know, in the Kurdish political movement as well, those people who lost their family members in the war are called the value families. And at the time when the Kurds were still able to run their municipalities, these people were given some positions within the municipality administration and so on. But obviously two sides in terms of the hegemonic power they hold and the political economy that they are indebted to are not the same. So I am curious to know, for example, when that debt belongs to someone that is not favored by the state or against the state. And within that question, I think the question of what happens to war veterans of the PKK. I have other questions to ask, but I think that's all for now.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mehmet. Really appreciate it. I think it would be great, John, if you could try to engage. You don't have to you know, answer everything because we have a couple of questions already, and I encourage the audience to post more.
I'll try to be really quick.
Yeah, sorry, just when you, I think it would be useful, the term Ghazi came up, and if you could explain that for our audience.
Sure, another one. So first of all, Mehmet, thank you so much for this general and detailed and wonderful reading and the questions that you posed. I completely agree that our works have a lot of parallels, and I wish that we could talk more about these parallels, but obviously we're talking about the similar time period, the kind of perpetrators against, you know, the civilian population and the PKK supporters, etc. So there are all sorts of parallels in terms of the use of the gendered notions of sacrifice, martyrdom, and I was fascinated to see those parallels as I read your work. So let me start by your first. Let me answer Nadia's question about the notion of Ghazi. Ghazi is often translated into English as veteran or war veteran, but actually it's a really polyphonous term that is a really heavy historical baggage. So Ghazi used to be, so it's a historic honorific that was initially used for Muslim warriors, and then it was incorporated into the Ottoman Empire and other kind of Muslim empires as a rank of distinction and military honor. And then during the foundation of the Republic, the founder of the Republic, Atatürk, took the title onto himself and became Gazi Mustafa Kemal. And then when the Turkish Republic was founded, the state continued to use it to sacralize state's war-making practices through religious means. So it started to use the notions of shahada, martyrdom, and Gaza and Ghazis to signify soldiers fighting for the secular state rather than Islam, right? So it has both, this kind of secular status implications, but also a heavy dose of Islamist history that creates this kind of ambiguous meaning zone that is strategically used by a variety of actors, primarily by the state. So coming to Mehmet's questions, you mentioned Rafi Rafet. One thing I should clarify, Rafi was not a veteran of the Kurdish war. He was injured much earlier, and he was a humanist, liberal, leftist kind of guy who was kind of an anomaly in this setting. And he was a really close. He was someone that I was really close. He was the only person that I saw after my fieldwork period. So, and in terms of the diversity, of course, he, as an Armenian veteran, he was a singular figure. But there were people coming from all kinds of ethnicities and sects, etc. That were I had. You're right. I mean, most of them obviously embodied a Sunni Turkish nationalist and ethnically Turkish background. But some of them were Bosnian, some of them were Alevi. To my knowledge, I had only one Kurdish disabled veteran, and basically he repeated the same discourse that you would hear from any Turkish nationalist, Kurdish citizen of the Turkish state, including village guards, that he's Kurdish, but he's proud to be a Turkish citizen, and he's proud to be fighting for the state. The PKK does not represent the Kurds. Actually, they're not Kurds themselves. Öcalan does not speak Kurdish. They're actually Armenians. They're the continuation of the Armenian secret army for the liberation of Armenia. All these discourses that you would hear in ultranationalist circles, including the Kurdish, ethnically Kurdish Turkish nationalist circles, he basically repeated them to me. There was an interesting case. He had an interesting case that I don't really narrate in the book, partly because there are all kinds of ethical and political complexities that surrounds this case that I could not really, disentangle. He was missing an ear, and he told me that it happened in a landmine explosion. But other veterans told me that his ear was chopped off when he was captured by the guerrillas because he was Kurdish and he was a Josh, he was a traitor. So really hard to know which version is true. But I mean, that's the kind of, and there's an unofficial policy. The Turkish state rarely deploys Kurds from the Kurdish region in the front lines. And, it has had a historical policy like that. Who gets deployed where, although supposedly it has to be random, it's never random. There are all kinds of decisions that are made at the military level as to who gets deployed where and who gets deployed in a combat position. Armenians, for example, also do not get deployed in combat positions. And of course, it's hard to verify those because it's an unofficial policy, like most of the Kurdish policies of the state. Village guards, that brings me to a really important point that I forgot to make when Nadia asked me about how I decided to work on this topic. Actually, in the early years of my graduate studies, I went to Sultanbeyli, an area that is a conservative area that is populated by conservative Kurds mainly, to explore politics of reproduction among Kurdish urban poor. And I ended up interviewing two disabled village guards, village guards who had disabilities. Obviously, they were not officially Ghazis because that's a title only reserved for soldiers, but they were given all kinds of exclusive rights bestowed on people fighting against the PKK. And what surprised me was that their narratives of gender and sexuality and family life and reproduction were intimately interwoven with their narratives of war and violence, etc. So that was one of the key moments when I decided to delve further into that. The being on the mountains question, actually mountains, as I use them, obviously I refer to the physical topography, the most inhospitable region in the world, etc. Kurds have no friends but the mountains. So I refer to mountains as physical structures, but it's also a chronotope, right? So it's the time, place of the conflict. And in that regard, mountains also include the civilian settlements, etc. And in the book, I talk very little about their evacuation. In the mountains chapter, there's a short piece where I talk about how they lamented their evacuation and burning of these beautiful villages and the shooting of the mules and the cattle so that they would not be used by the guerrillas, etc. But you're right, most of it is silence. People rarely talk about war crimes. They generally insinuate them. For example, one of my informants continuously talked about something that was unclear to me. It was like saying we shouldn't have done those. It's against religion. And now I see, but back then, obviously he was talking about dismemberment of guerrilla bodies, but he never uttered it in clear sentences. It was always insinuated. And then when you ask further, there's silence. And partly because I'm recording that, right? So people also have concerns in relation to the context of utterance. The Southeast syndrome, I don't talk about it much in the book because I have written it elsewhere in detail. Southeast syndrome is the kind of term, again, that was borrowed from the Vietnam lexicon, post-Vietnam syndrome, and that was used to refer to all kinds of mental health problems that conscripted soldiers were experiencing that led to violence in the cities, people killing their families, committing suicides, hijacking plane in one case in 1995, I believe. And of course, because of the way that war trauma has been historically implicated in anti-war movements, there was a lot of denial on the state side, right? I mean, until recently. Among my informants, there was no one who had an official PTSD diagnosis. And actually, maybe there were a handful of veterans who got Ghazi benefits due to PTSD diagnosis. Now, the situation is changing a little bit, but still, in broad terms, it's more or less the same. The state denies that there are widespread, mental and psychic consequences of armed conflict. And when I interviewed ex-military officers, for example, they would say, those mental health problems, you see them in imperialist armies fighting in other people's land to steal their land, etc. You don't see them here because we're fighting in our nation to save our nation, and we're a military nation anyway. So you don't have, every Turk is proud to serve in the military. So you can see the kind of nationalist closure around mental health. And then your question about death and sacrifice and of course, yes, that's a very important point, the kind of shared political universe on the two sides of the conflict. This is a common theme in ethnographies of political violence, right? There are clashing sides, but in order to clash, you have to have an interface. You have to have a cultural interface that enables clashing over certain things while sharing many other things like the notions of martyrdom, there was even a shared notion of Gaza. There was a short-lived Kurdish Ghazis organization Kurdistan Ghazis Union, which was a mainly European-based organization. But there were kind of competing claims over Gaza, and martyrdom is obviously exactly more or less the same. But of course, as you're right, I mean, the symbolic and political economy is different. One has the state on its side with all the kinds of benefits and the financial incentives, etc. And the other is criminalized, right? Even the the cemeteries for martyred, so-called martyred guerrillas are destroyed by state forces. So what your question about what happens when debt is owed to someone who is not favored by the state? That's a really interesting question, because when you think about it from the perspective of the United States, if you're a veteran, you're a veteran, right? You can have all kinds of political views. State may not favor you, but that would not change your veteran status. It's not the same in Turkey. Ghazi status is contingent on many things, and it can be revoked as easily as it's given. And actually, in the early days of the conflict in the 90s, there was an anti-war inclined association in Izmir, which was shut down. And so, like who can exist in the political realm as veterans or martyrs' families, and who gets shut off is an important question. And now you can see, I mean, in the book, I discuss veterans activism, which mainly takes the form of anti-government, anti-AKP protests, right? And right now, of course, there's no way that you would be engaged in such protests. And some of the disabled veterans and martyrs families that I knew from my field still insist on doing that. And now they're criminalized. They are sued by the government or by President Erdogan. And so they don't have the same kind of legitimacy anymore. And this becomes really evident when you think about the most recent Ghazis, the Ghazis of the July 15th failed coup attempt, right? The AKP government bestowed the Ghazi status through an extraordinary emergency decree onto these people who were injured as they tried to stop the soldiers, even if they were not disabled, right? And for a while, they even replaced the Ghazis of the Kurdish were in terms of their legitimacy, etc., until they merged with them. But very recently, like a couple of months ago, they had a protest against the government in front of the AKP center in Ankara. And suddenly, I mean, they were so criminalized and stigmatized, and they were suddenly, associated with criminality and terror and Fethullah terrorist organization, etc., that the whole aura of legitimacy around them disappeared. So you can see it's always contested and contingent. And I should stop here so that we have time for other things. Thank you, though. Those were great questions.
So now I would like to share two questions that came from the audience. One from Ekin Zeltimis. So, Jans, your use of word war when describing the Kurdish conflict was striking, given the fact that Turkish political figures do not agree how to call the situation. What aspects of the conflict made you call it a war? Can we still call this way today? Given your field of research on the subject, what possible solutions can you recommend for the resolution of the Kurdish conflict, or will it ever be resolved? And I'd like to also ask Mehmet to respond, but let me first share the second question here, which is by Zeynep Ertugrul, who asks, in your book, you use the term ultranationalist to talk about the ideological commitments of your interlocutors. But as a reader familiar with cultural references in Turkey, to which you refer to, I feel like a lot of anecdotes in your book echoes with the very banal nationalism that I encounter in Turkey in daily life. So what makes their nationalism ultra, in your opinion? In reference to what? So Mehmet, would you like to have a first go at the first question? And also if you have any thoughts on the second question.
Yes, sure. Well, for the first question, I mean, is our reference point our political figures to decide what is war or not? Definitely, I am not coming from a law discipline, so I cannot really define what is war and how it is defined in that discipline. But as a lived experience, I think many people in the 1990s know very well what is war for the Kurds, and that's all.
Okay. Do you want to say anything about the second question or not?
No, that's
okay. So John?
So when people, talk about war, I guess what they have in mind is the interstate wars, right? And when war is used to define a kind of so-called internal conflict or low intensity conflict or dirty war, etc., there are many names in the literature. Some people get disturbed, including our politicians, because the idea is that, of course, if it's a war, it means two legitimate parties. It means being subject to international war laws, etc. And there's a lot of anxiety around that. Anyone who experienced the 1990s would know what I'm talking about when I say war. We are talking about a guerrilla army in, hundreds fighting with thousands, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, etc. And I mean, today, actually, it's even more like a war in that regard, maybe not within the boundaries of Turkey because of the securitization and dronization and etc. The kind of military conflict, the form of military conflict that we had in the 90s will never repeat itself, most likely, because we have Kalekos, these big military fortresses. We have the use of the topography in novel ways. We have dronization, which makes impossible for anything like a guerrilla army to cross the borders, etc. We have surveillance technologies. But if you think about the transnational aspects of this, Turkey is basically, invading Syrian territory. Of course, invasion is also a kind of loaded word. Turkey is having incursions into the Syrian territory and staying there permanently because of the anxieties surrounding its own Kurdish question. That's the main reason. So actually it's a transnational, it's always been, Kurdish conflict has always been transnational, but now it's more transnational than ever. And it's more warlike than ever because, the kind of the state army attacking cities or kind of capturing cities because they are held by groups that are affiliated, according to the state, with the PKK. So I think it's pretty obvious in that regard. And then, of course, I'm not using it in legalistic sense. I'm not just like Mehmet. I'm an anthropologist. I'm not a legal scholar. I'm not an international studies scholar. I'm not really interested in the use of war in that regard. Solution, any conflict that resembles the Kurdish conflict in the world, and there are many, including those in Europe, in Ireland, in Spain, etc. They show us how these kind of conflicts can be resolved. I mean, obviously, there needs to be. There were a lot of talks about Sri Lanka model because Sri Lanka was the only country who tried to end that kind of conflict with kind of complete annihilation of the other party. And some ultranationalists in Turkey are so fond of the Sri Lanka model, which even in technical terms would not work. Of course, I'm not even talking about its ethical implications, its human costs, etc. But even in technical terms, there's no way that anything like that would work. So the solution is very clear. Anyone who looks at the Irish case, the Latin American cases, El Salvador, so it's very clear the way ahead. The second question,
sorry, what do you mean it's very clear? Can you just be a bit more explicit?
It's very clear. Turkey actually entered this path in the 2010s. There were on and off peace negotiations between the government and and the PKK. I mean, there were open, I mean, not so open because there were, I mean, they were hidden. They were not brought in front of the parliament, but there were negotiations, right? You need disarmament. You need to recognize, obviously, the legitimate, rights and demands of the Kurdish people. And then so that's one thing. And then there's the armed conflict itself. And then you need negotiations, you need disarmament, you need, there are all kinds of settlement issues. What would happen to all kinds of people who have spent their lives, in war, including village guards, including guerrillas, including now a big professional army? What's going to happen to those? What's going to happen to war crimes? What is going to be done in terms of reconciliation? So, whatever has been done in other parts of the world, that's the way ahead. And I don't think there's any other path ahead. The second question about ultranationalism, this is a great one. And actually, I answered that in a footnote. Maybe I should have included in the main text. When I say ultranationalism, I'm not talking about this kind of unhealthy deviation from a healthy form of nationalism. I mean, most of our audience, Zeynep Ertuğrul, is right to say that most of the things that you can find in the book are from a very banal nationalist lexicon, and that's right. When I say ultranationalism, I'm referring to a novel form of political movement that emerged in the 2000s and kind of merged and brought together the previously competing nationalist factions of left and right against the European Union, against minority rights, against democratic reforms, etc. So, for example, Nationalist Action Party, the classical fascist, neo-fascist, ultranationalist party in Turkey, and factions within Ulusalcı factions within the Republican People's Party, etc., could all come together in a way that was never possible before in the 2000s, in the mid 2000s. This is Ulusalcılık or ultranationalism. So that's what I refer to as ultranationalism, not this kind of, deviant ideology that is qualitatively different from state ideology. Because if I define it like that, state ideology is ultranationalist in Turkey. When I try to find correlations of sacrificial discourses or that are deployed by the Turkish state, and when I translate them into English and try to find historical parallels, what I see is the Third Reich or Imperial Japan, etc., all these sacrificial, bloody, gory discourses, people giving up their, gladly giving their body parts for the perpetuity of the state, etc. This is Imperial Japan, so, or Third Reich. And I should, that's all I want to say about that. But Mehmet had a...
Yeah, Mehmet, you wanted to come in here.
Yeah, maybe just a small note on the politics of naming and the hegemony that is held over taxonomies and how it is defined. I mean, for Turkey, it is never going to be called a war. As John said, like clear invasion is packed as an olive branch operation. So in that regard, I think naming an issue is a very controversial matter, and most of the time, really not calling a war is just like an avoidance, not to recognize what has happened in the past and what has been happening still. Well, in that regard, I just remembered an issue that I would like to raise about naming the region. I know in a footnote you express that it is an ambiguous term, and for many people it could mean many things, as you explained, and I think it is a very loaded word. So it is very understandable for people to avoid state ire, not to use Kurdistan, Northern Kurdistan, Southern Turkey, Southeastern Turkey, Eastern Turkey, or this and that. But I wonder about your choice of the word? Like, why did you prefer to use it, the region, to keep it ambiguous? And I mean, speaking of that, I also feel the need to kind of underline the situation of scholars who are from repressive countries, authoritarian countries, that every single scholar needs to make a choice every single time when they use this kind of discourses, regardless whether they live outside or inside the country. So I wonder whether you didn't use the word Kurdistan because of these concerns or something else.
Good but tough question. Obviously, that concern plays a big role, and I'm not going to deny that. The use of Kurdistan, even as a historical reference, as you know, is banned by the state, and depending on the political climate, you can be heavily persecuted for it, etc. But I guess there's more to it, which I indicate. I mean, the ambiguity of the term allows me to navigate that terrain in a way that I would not be able to if I use Kurdistan per se. And then, of course, academically, historically, I'm not against the use of the term Kurdistan, but historically speaking, there are complexities in terms of, for example, Western Armenia, Kurdistan, where does it start, where does it end, etc. There are these kind of, but of course, that's not the reason why I did not use it. Mainly, it was a practical choice. And as a secondary concern, I wanted to keep the ambiguous reference. And also, I guess I'm intimately attached to the term region, because that was the term that we used to use in the 90s. And everyone knew when you said bölge, what you were talking about. And if you look at the human rights reports, etc., in the 90s, which I'm mainly talking about because most of my informants fought in the 90s, it's always the bölgedeki çatışmalar, the conflict in the bölge, in the region, etc. So, but again, I mean, yes, the spectral force of state persecutory hand is something that a citizen of a repressive country cannot easily escape. But there's also a downside to it. I mean, by not using it, we are reproducing the kind of hegemony in a way. So I now I'm using it in certain places. But in the book, I chose to use the term that I originally used, which was the region, and then explained it in a footnote.
Yeah, thank you. So we have another question by Said Achan. Thanks for the presentation and important work. Would it be possible to share if you have had opportunities to engage your interlocutors since the book's publication and how they have received your arguments and interventions? Also, if there's time, how do you envision the future of the intersection between masculinity studies and Middle East studies? And maybe sort of linked on that, I mean, I had a question also about the specific contestations of masculinity and how it intersects with disability in a context where the gendered regime of citizenship in Turkey has been changing radically since the 90s. I mean, when we think about ideal constructions of gender and gendered policies, there has been a radical shift. So how within that shift, that obviously, I mean, so I'm more, I guess, versatile in terms of the way that women have been affected, but clearly this also affected notions of masculinity. So if you would be able to maybe combine this set of questions.
Sure. So let me start with the very first one. The answer is very basic. No, I haven't, because of the reasons that I indicated. I do not have any relation with my interlocutors in the field. And at this point that I'm visible, my name has been published in pro-government and nationalist websites. I've been targeted individually by like because of the peace petition and everything. And now my work is out, my political positionality is clear. So I would not risk that situation. So the question is no. And it's interesting because there has been a turn in anthropology. Mehmet rightly pointed at that in the beginning of his conversation. I mean, anthropology, after decades of self-critique, basically took a turn when people started to do work with people that they sympathize with and they politically align with. And of course, that led to dialogical anthropology, activist anthropology, etc., sharing your research with your interlocutors before it's published. And I respect all these decisions and strategies, but there are limits to it. That was a particular vision of anthropology, which is not really that possible in context like Mehmet's research or my research. So the answer is no. The second question about masculinity studies. Masculinity studies is a new field in the broader Middle East studies. And, there have been some fascinating works in masculinity, critical masculinity studies in the Middle East, as well as sexuality studies, which are all new fields. I teach several, I used to teach and I still teach several classes on gender in the Middle East or sexualities in the Middle East, gender and violence in the Middle East. And then when I taught them like 6 years ago, there were, a handful of ethnographies, monographs in book form. And now, there are so many great books. There are so many great works that I can assign. So it's a rapidly blossoming field, but still we need to do so much. Disability studies, on the other hand, is a really, really, really embryonic field in Middle Eastern studies. And there are some recent works that have been published. There was an edited volume on disability in the Arab world, but it's still very embryonic. And so the kind of intersection of these two fields, masculinity studies and disability studies, as well as sexuality studies and disability studies, is still awaits kind of new contributions. In terms of your question, Nadia, yeah, that's a really important question. I mean, one of the things that makes ethnographic research really difficult in Turkey is that it's really hard to capture, present time, because as you start writing on your ethnographic findings, what you write in the present tense feels like history. And then what you feel like history suddenly comes back in a way that haunts the present. So, getting the researcher off guard. In terms of, for example, and this is, I think the realm of the governing of gender relations in Turkey is one of the fields where you can observe this most clearly. In the 2000s, when the AKP branded itself as a liberal Muslim conservative party, etc., and pursued European Union membership, it basically passed some of the most progressive reforms in the realm of gender relations, right? Against violence against, in terms of violence against women, in terms of the creation of women's shelters, in terms of the getting away with the necessity of a woman using her spouse's last name. So many things, right? So it seemed like there was the kind of dismantling of the patriarchal power relations in Turkey. What happened then? Suddenly, as the political climate shifts in Turkey, now we see what Deniz Kandiyoti calls the kind of masculinist restoration project, which is even more violent against women, which is even more violent against sexual minorities, which bans the pride walk that was initially started during the reign of the AKP, etc. So it's constantly shifting. And obviously, in terms of its effects on masculinity, there was a moment when, it seemed like the kind of the intertwinement of masculinity and violence that the state allowed would wither away, right? Whether it's in the form of compulsory military service, whether it was in the form of soccer matches, whether it was in the form of violence against women. Women started going into soccer matches actually when a team was banned to have fans in the stadium. Women and children were allowed in the stadium, etc. And now look at the talk now. People are saying, people are saying, oh, women should not be allowed in football. It's a man's sport. So you can basically trace it in every single field in the society, how this kind of patriarchal, kind of heteropatriarchal kind of ideas and structures and power relations seemed like they were being dismantled, at times from top down, but also due to the long-term struggles of the feminist movement and LGBT queer movement. And then you have this wave of masculinist restoration and a new wave of violence. And in terms of military service, it's really interesting because there were talks about the formation of a professional army, and Turkey did not need conscripted soldiers. And that was part of the AKP's peace attempts initially. And now look at what happened after the 2016, 15-16. Those professional army forces are committing all kinds of acts against the Kurdish civilian population that, you could not even, some of which you could not even imagine in the 90s, like, writing in people's bedrooms, using their lipsticks, girls, we were here, etc. All kinds of sexist graffiti in people's intimate spaces, etc. But I should stop here so that we can answer, or maybe Mehmet has things to say on these points.
Mehmet, did you want to come in here?
Yes, I would like to, well, maybe, a little question to John. We have been talking about the Islamization of politics in the last 20 years and how basically it has affected all this social and political fields. But in relation to your book and your informants, what was the situation of religiosity? At least in one of the informants' testimony, we see that he is an Islamist, but apart from that, I don't see religiosity. And as an anthropologist of religion, I am kind of curious to see how these people engage with religion and the afterlife, especially in connection to this heavily religiously lauded words such as martyrs and Ghazi and all.
So John, we're running out of time, so you have to be very quick, but I also quickly wanted to share, just a couple of comments here. One by Ekin Curtis, who asked, in the course of your research, did you encounter any moments of a different kind of sacrificial crisis where questions such as, what are we sacrificing ourselves, our body parts for, emerged? And if so, how did your interlocutors tackle with such moments of crisis? And Francis Hasso, sort of following up on your previous discussion on the intersections of gender and disability studies, is asking about the connections between debilitation, racialization, and sexuality, and specifically queer theory. And so she is thinking, for example, about just Pierre-Poi's arguments in The Right to Maim. John, we literally just have 2 minutes, so if you could sort of try, you don't have to answer everything, but just sort of some.
Okay, just a couple of points. Mehmet's question. There were no political Islamists in the circle that I attended, aside from this guy who was associated with the Sufi Brotherhood. They were ordinary conservative folks. Most of them went to the Friday prayer. did not pray daily. They define themselves as kind of, most of them as conservative, some of them in other terms, but they were not strictly pious in that regard. Maybe now it has changed. Of course, people's practices have changed a lot over the last decade or so. In response to Ekin's wonderful question about different kinds of sacrificial crisis, people shift between discourses. They juggle different discourses, and it really is contextual. In their, in their private spaces, when I talk to them in private spaces, they would say all sorts of things, including I gave this arm for nothing. The terrorists are not the real terrorists, are in the parliament, not referring to the HDP, referring to the government sometimes, or, like they would say all sorts of things. They would articulate all kinds of different political sentiments. But what can be articulated in public and what can become hegemonic? That's the question, because I'm very much interested in the formation of political hegemony and the kind of discourses that can be articulated in the field, in the public space. In response to the other question, I'm a big fan, of course, of Jasbir Puar's work and debilitation. I only engage with her right to maim in the last part of the book when I talk about the state's deliberate use of riot control agents in a way to maim people during the Gezi uprising. But you can broaden this argument. I mean, you can talk about the curfews in 2016 in a way that would echo Jasbir Puar's discussion of the Zionist Zionist occupation regime and its use of nutritional calories. You can, obviously find many parallels between her discussion of debilitation and sexualization and racialization, but unfortunately, I don't have more time to say more.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, John. Thanks a lot, Mehmet. This was a very interesting and rich discussion. Clearly, we could have gone on for much longer, but thank you both. And I also thank the audience for their questions. The event will be made available after a little bit of editing. We have recorded it so we can share it amongst friends and colleagues. And well, thanks again. And
thank you so much, Nadia.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mehmet. And thanks everyone who asked questions and listened to us. Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye, everyone.